Welcome to the Changing the Terms podcast. I'm your host, Mike Klein. In this series, we're going to meet some of the world's comms disruptors. These are people who are working in and around the communication fields who are really changing the game, challenging old assumptions, acting on new ideas, and demonstrating a willingness to share those ideas. Today's guest is no exception, Darren Briggs. Darren is an author, executive coach, facilitator, and consultant who has spent over 30 years helping people and organizations simply talk to each other to build trust and unlock performance. Having started life as an internal comm specialist, Darren draws on expertise and experience in over 25 years in-house with Vodafone, PepsiCo, Nike, Microsoft, and British Airways, working in HR marketing and corporate comms. Darren believes that most organizations overcomplicate what and how they communicate with their people, and his purpose is to make things simple and help leaders influence through what they say and what they do. Welcome aboard,
Thank you, Mike.
Darren. Very nice
Thank you,
to
Mike.
have
It's
you
a pleasure to
today.
be here, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation with you today.
Outstanding. So we're looking back on your career working both with leaders and with communication pros. Where can communicators become more effective in engaging leaders?
It's a really good question, and it's something that I'm asked pretty frequently, actually. I was with a group of professional communicators last week, running some workshops with them, and it was a question that was asked last week to me. And I think really one of the things that I've learned over the years is this ability to really be able to understand their priorities, and put yourself in their shoes so you can really kind of empathize with their position, and on the back of that really understand what their almost their pain points are when it comes to achieving them, because very often communication is at the heart of a lot of the issues that they actually have, whether it's about engaging other people to buy into their priorities, or indeed influencing people to actually work with them in terms of delivering them. So communication pretty often becomes the root kind of cause of both success and failure when it comes to leaders actually achieving the priorities they have. And I think the quicker people understand their priorities and think about how their pain points might be holding them back, I think that's the route to success.
So really what you're talking about is for communication pros, A, to become better listeners so that they can, get A, elicit those pain points, and B, get an understanding of what's driving those pain points. But you also talked about
Mm.
empathy. What do you think is the biggest challenge for communication pros in terms of empathizing with leaders? What kind of shows up in your
Yeah,
experience?
again, great question. And I think the listening point is a really important part of it. And listening actually is arguably the secret sauce when it comes to developing empathy with leaders. And with that, normally requires a real skill in terms of being able to ask great questions. And again, I go back to the point: if you can really understand the agenda of your leader that you're working with, that then allows you to be able to ask the really good questions, which gets under the skin of the issues, and therefore you can begin to demonstrate that you're listening to what they're saying. And then in terms of empathizing with them, I think we can empathize with people in lots of different ways. I mean, one is to just simply listen to what they're saying. I think also you can demonstrate empathy by talking their language as well, and you can also empathize with them at a more human level if they've got other challenges going on in their lives, which may be having an effect in terms of how they're feeling and how they're behaving at that particular moment in time.
So really talking about getting underneath what the business problems is, using the business language to those to articulate, to reframe, to represence those problems, and perhaps build a bridge between the feeling of those problems and the extent to which they're articulated and
Mm,
understood. And also, ideally, to get to a point in the relationship where that leader will share with you about what's going on in their lives, what's going on in the background, um,
absolutely.
anything from a golf game to, a child's frustrations in school,
Absolutely,
for
and
instance.
I found that in my career, whether it be my corporate career or indeed my more recent career as a consultant and as a coach. I found that the most successful relationships I've had is where you get past that point of it being, I mean, you can still be professional, but beyond being professional, where actually the individual feels that they can really confide in you about all sorts of different things. And arguably that takes you to the point of becoming a trusted advisor rather than just a service provider within an organization. And that level of kind of intimacy that you get when you are working with somebody where they feel that they can share with you things that maybe they wouldn't talk to other people about because A, they trust you, you're not going to go away and divulge that information to other people, but also because they know that you're just being listened to, they're being listened to, is a skill and a quality, I think, which sets people above others when it comes to the way they operate in terms of being a great communications practitioner. And since leaving corporate life, as I've worked with people in house, what I see is those that have that ability to be able to develop those types of relationships with their leaders are typically the ones who are arguably more successful than those that haven't.
So, really in essence, it's about moving beyond the transactional in the relationships with leaders so that you're not just simply doing, they're asking you to do or what you think they're asking you to do, but actually um, to be able to build a human relationship that then moves well beyond that. Is that
Yeah,
basically what you're
absolutely. I
saying?
mean, you've got to have credibility to be able to even get through the door in the first place, and the credibility is typically built around your skills and your experience and the competency that you have in the role that you're there for. And people will judge your credibility often on those things in terms of skills and experience, but also your credibility around how reliable you are in terms of getting things done. Are you credible in terms of the amount of expertise and knowledge that you have in terms of what you do as well, and also your credibility in terms of why you're there, and are you there to do things for your own gain and your own interest, or are you there as someone who is having a kind of a clear purpose to help the other person, and all of those things kind of help shape the credibility that you need to have in order to be able to be that kind of trusted advisor. But then once you've got that, you can then go beyond that, and the relationship then elevates itself to a different level when you know that the leader that you're working with is beginning to talk to you about things that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise heard. So I remember years ago when I worked for one major corporate that will remain nameless, but I was working with the chief executive, and he started talking a lot about the reasons why he enjoyed doing some of the work with me. He said because he said, I'm transparent in terms of the feedback that he hears from around the business, and that he felt quite comfortable talking to me about some of the challenges that he had with his own leadership team. And fast forward to today, as working as a consultant and as a facilitator and as a coach with senior leaders, it's interesting that the really rich relationships that I have are typically with those senior executives who are very open at talking to me about some of the challenges that they have with, both their business, but also arguably with the people and the team that they have around them.
You mentioned we've talked earlier about this. I want to shift the focus a bit from the challenge of building relationships
Mm.
generally to a fairly specific challenge, which was really the challenge that sparked me having this conversation with you today. We talked earlier about the challenges communication pros have in creating compelling business
Hmm.
cases. And certainly part of it is the issue of business acumen, talking about the business in the business's terms, understanding the business issues
Hmm.
generally. But you mentioned specifically that shifting the focus from value, from demonstrating what you get from a communications intervention versus what you put in, to risk mitigation could change the
Hmm.
game. Could you spell out
Yeah,
why?
sure. I mean, look, this is an age-old debate that you and I have had many times over cups of coffee and glasses of wine over the years, and it's an age-old debate that I've heard many, many times in my travels and talking with people in our community. And to be honest, it's a bit of a boring subject now. I'm going to be a bit controversial here because we hear about this all the time. It's almost like this age-old plea from communicators, please take me seriously because, I'm very good at what I do and that we do add value and all this kind of stuff. And how do we get a seat at the table and how do we have more influence? And actually, I think part of the problem that we've had is that we've placed too much emphasis in some regards in terms of how we add value into the organisation. I think we've got to get over it. I mean, the reality is that communications professionals are a cost to the business. We're an overhead, and so trying to kind of demonstrate value in the sense that somebody in sales does who's bringing in revenue into an organization is almost impossible to do. I mean, a few years ago, corporate communications professionals like to measure the value they brought from a media perspective, a media relations perspective, with things like advertising value equivalent of what press coverage might bring, and that was quickly found to be kind of a pointless exercise actually because it's very difficult to quantify. And in internal communications, we've had in recent years all sorts of descriptions around how to develop value through employee engagement and the productivity that brings and all this business. And it's a bit of an argument that's quite weak actually. And I've found in the past when I talk with people who are very rational in terms of how they think, and I'm talking here specifically about the CFO, who typically is the person who manages the purse strings in an organization. The emotive argument about, if we do these things in internal communication, it's going to make people feel a lot better, and therefore we're going to be a much better company, doesn't really wash. So you've got to look at, you've got to speak the language of the CFO, and the language of the CFO is hard, pounds and pence and dollars and cents. It's about how does what's this going to do in terms of the bottom line here. But the one thing I do know is that CFOs are also very risk averse. They are people who are there to mitigate risk in an organization, and in particular, when they're sitting on the board of an organization as well. So as an executive director sitting on the board of a company, they have a responsibility to manage risk, and that's principally what a board is all about. And the CEO is the same to a certain degree as well. So I found that in more kind of recent years, actually the better way of trying to engage people is less about trying to prove a concept of value, which is very difficult to quantify and position with somebody who's very rational in their thought, to think more about mitigating risk as a result of what you do, which becomes a more compelling argument. And when you say to a CFO or a CEO, is this a risk you're prepared to take? All of a sudden, it becomes a very different type of conversation.
So, how would a communication leader, say, for instance, um, a relatively recent arrival
Mm-hmm.
to to the C-suite conversation, somebody who's new to an
Mm-hmm.
organization, or somebody who's just come up from the ranks, how would that communicator approach the idea of a risk-based business case for the
No,
first time? How do you start this
it's a good
conversation?
one. I mean, I think there are several examples that you can use very very quickly. Actually, so one thing that everyone's experiencing these days is change, um, and communicators like to talk about how important communications is within change, and actually, all the evidence kind of backs that up. So, I very frequently refer to John Cotter's research on change, and the fact that without communicating and getting people to buy in, the chances of change succeeding, i.e., delivering on all of its objectives, is unlikely. It's diminished. And so, buy-in is a direct correlation to how you communicate with people about what you're trying to do. So change is an easy one to kind of begin to kind of set the scene around, and then the question then is one of, I'll give you an example. Actually, I did some work a few years ago with a big FMCG company, a big global FMCG company, who had one of the big consulting houses in to do a massive strategic review, huge strategic review of their organization. The CEO had gone public on this in terms of, because he had to talk about what was going to happen, and of course, the city and the investors were all looking at this to see what level of return it was going to bring. But also, they had spent a significant amount of money. Bringing in a Bain or a McKinsey for a big strategic review, you're not going to see much change out of $20 million. And so, my question to them was one of, don't try and think about the value the communications activity is going to create within the organization. Think about how it's going to mitigate the risk of your change not working to what you've set it out to do. So, are you prepared to take the risk of all your leaders not buying into change when all the evidence points that if they're not, it's unlikely to be successful? And all of a sudden, because they're spending $20 million on, a McKinsey or a Bain to do these things, and they've set their stall out to the city, it becomes quite a compelling argument for them to actually, invest to mitigate that risk. So that's one very simple, clear example of how it can be played out. I mean, there's another one I can give you. Again, I was working with a group of lawyers with one of the Magic Circle firms, and their big issue was the amount of information that flows around the organization, but also the volume of email in particular, which is an age-old issue for many communicators. How do we manage this kind of avalanche of email that comes through into our organization, because it just doesn't seem to be effective? And we did a very simple exercise over the course of a week where the PAs of the managing partners that literally registered how much email did they get. And we worked it out that they were wasting, on average, around $20 million worth of billable time. Yes, so the amount of wasted time that they were using on email that was irrelevant, it worked out to around 20. It was around between 20 to $30 million worth of lost billable time. And all of a sudden, they sat up and started to listen, because my comment to them is, are you prepared to carry on working in this way? And that the risk that this creates for you is you're going to lose opportunities that you could have otherwise had. And lawyers, they love billable time. So we're speaking their language, talking about the risk to their organization, and all of a sudden it became a reason for change. So that gives you two very simple examples of how risk can play out very well.
Well, let's explore that a bit further, because obviously communicators often deal differently with different C suite portfolios. HR, obviously, IT, operations. And it's not just about reporting line, it's also just about how can we best serve their interests and how can we best partner with
Mhm.
them. What would be risk-based angles that we could use to shift conversations, say with HR, for
Yeah, I mean,
instance?
so one with HR could be around attrition, and it could be about the conversation that HR might be having around talent management and talent retention. So people can very quickly see on Glassdoor very publicly how organisations are, and that obviously has an impact on the employer brand. So one can have some interesting conversations with HR about the impact of communications in terms of how people talk about the organisation, and the level of transparency that might exist. So that could be one particular angle one could take. Another way to look at HR would be through the lens again of change management. So HR typically have a very heavy role when it comes to managing change within an organisation, and so if their lens of communication through change is very transactional, about sending out announcements and just telling the organisation, but also to a degree worrying about some of the consultation things, what they're not doing is thinking about the bigger picture and the effect that that has on the wider community within an organisation. So there are a number of ways I think one can begin to hook in constituents into all of this thing. IT is a classic, with the CIO and the CTOs are classic ones as well. They will very often push pretty hard on things like, new technologies into an organization, whether it's a new intranet or a new, using AI or whatever it might be. But ultimately, to get people to use technology, there's a human dimension to it. People are not going to use technology unless they understand why it's being introduced and what's expected of them as a result and what their benefit will be as a result of doing it. That is a communications based activity. And so, questions of the CTO is, Mr. or Mrs. CTO, you can put in place the most amazing technology solution into your organization. But if people don't work with it, then it's not going to happen. And so, is that a risk that you're prepared to take? So let's invest in it properly.
So really, what you're saying is that you often see in organizations that CIOs, CTOs bring in new technology, they underinvest in making the case for adoption, and then the technology is effectively a loss to the organization.
Frequently.
So that's basically one argument about
Mm.
risk. There's another argument around risk that I wanted to run by you, and that is that certainly from an information security standpoint, the ability to communicate the risks of lousy information security practices um, actually produce measurable impacts for communication efforts, because you can double measure the things that you're emphasizing in your communication, the new
Yeah,
behaviors, the new practices, and you can see whether they're being adopted, but also you can see the extent to which they're being not adopted when that communication's not taking
absolutely.
place.
Absolutely, I think that's true, and whether it's around misinformation, occurring around the organisation, and the potential consequences of that, both internally and externally, whether it's about security of the information that you have within your organisation, and how that's used. Again, these are not value creation activities in terms of communicating with people. Communicating to people about things like how you ensure that you have secure information and secure data is not going to add value to the organization. What you're doing is you're mitigating the risk of that actually happening and that being compromised. And that's why we're here. We're not here to create value. The word value has just been, I think, misinterpreted and misused.
You mentioned AI as a particularly interesting issue at the moment. Do you see a specific risk mitigation narrative around AI that comms leaders can capitalize on?
Yeah, AI is a really interesting one. I mean, my view on it is that comms leaders should embrace AI, from a functional perspective, because if they don't, they're going to become irrelevant. They're going to become irrelevant and redundant to what's being used. So AI has some profound opportunities, but impact on professional communicators generally. I think there's a lot of noise about AI right now, which is both positive and negative, and so part of the challenge for communicators within an organization is to work with the organization to explain to people how AI will be of benefit to this organization moving forward. Because the risk of not doing so is that the rumors will go out of control about the negative implications of it and the consequences that people are already beginning to kind of dream up, which is principally about job losses. It's going to make my job redundant. So, I think there's two angles to AI. One is professional communicators need to wise up very quickly about how AI can be leveraged to its best effect within the communications community, and become a new way of building the support that the function gives an organization. But secondly, I think there is a big role to be played in terms of changing the narrative on AI within an organization to mitigate the risk of it being perceived as a very negative thing.
So essentially, you see kind of two core areas of opportunity. One is around, really getting some influence over the overall AI conversation to help steer it and steer it in a positive direction, and avoid the conservatism that will come from functions that'll say, nope, we can't do this, it's too risky,
Yeah,
what have you. But also, um, in leveraging the tools. And I mean, what came up when you were talking is that, um, could these tools become so do it yourself for other players and other folks and organizations, like creating videos, like creating content, etc., that this is also a risk to the comms role itself that needs to be managed, mitigated, and contextually used.
absolutely. I mean, we only have to look outside of our own kind of four walls to see what's going on in the rest of the world. And in the world of journalism, AI will completely change the face of journalism. It already has, already started to. A lot of what you see online from news outlets online is AI generated content, and that's going to continue to be the way. And so, I think looking at kind of some of the service elements of what communication does within an organization, arguably AI will make it redundant. So the question then is, what can one do in order to support the organization moving forward? And that therefore lends itself to becoming more of a kind of trusted advisor, a counsel to the organization, which provides more strategic advice as opposed to necessarily doing the kind of the service delivery side of things. Because I think AI will end up replacing a lot of that activity in the future, whether it's about writing an announcement, doing a video, or even doing research for employee engagement surveys and all this kind of stuff. AI will eventually kind of take on a lot of that heavy lifting, and so I think with communications people, they're gonna have to wise up to what AI will do in terms of becoming a massive disruptor to the function, but equally thinking about how to, rather than being fearful of it, use it as an opportunity to reinvent.
So, aside from AI, and there's a huge amount of conversation going on around AI about what it will do, how we need to, and you've articulated some of the core issues around how we interact with AI. But looking more broadly at the room for disruption in the internal com space in particular, what do you see as other disruptive opportunities that smart communication leaders should take advantage of?
Well, yeah, I think a lot of it is technological based, and the pace of change of technology is so rapid right now. It's both scary but exciting at the same time. It's a real roller coaster. I mean, I think if you go back to what happened in the pandemic, where people went from working in offices to literally going virtual in the space of weeks. I mean, there was probably more change in 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 10 years. We saw more change over 5 weeks, 4 or 5 weeks, than we did in 10 years in any organization. So the rapid acceleration of new technologies to enable people to connect was something that we witnessed and experienced very, very quickly over that time. But actually, the technology that's coming down the path is going to be even more kind of revolutionary. So the one that I think there's a couple of things that are going to change the game quite considerably. I mean, we've talked about AI, but I think we should not ignore the metaverse either. And the work that's going on around there that will create a far more virtual world in which we operate and work within, and that's going to change things. We're seeing the advent of kind of 6G technology will become a reality in places like South Korea within the next year or two. And with 6G technology, the speed of transmission on cell phones is going to grow exponentially. And already with a 5G phone, you can Google it online, but it's possible to do a hologram call. And with 6G technology, it'd be very possible to do a hologram call. So we'll be moving into a world of real virtual connectivity where it's not just about looking at people in the screen. We actually have ourselves a virtual presence in the room as well, and that's going to change everything from meetings like this, these types of conversations, to how you're going to run a town hall. You could end up in 5 years' time. It would not be unrealistic to expect a town hall, a global town hall, to be a metaverse experience.
That's really interesting. I mean, I can kind of visualize that. And I've been somewhat of a critic of the town hall format over the years, but I'm thinking, wow, this could be mind blowing if you actually got people in a semi physical presence in a semi physical
Yeah,
room interacting with each other much more naturally than
yeah,
we do, in the likes of a conversation
yeah.
like this. I want to kind of walk away from the technology and the disruption side of things for a second. A lot of hosts on podcasts and in events ask their guests what advice would they give their younger self. But I think a key issue at the moment right now is that we've got a lot of people who are our age, a little bit younger, a little bit older, who really find themselves on the bench at this point. What advice would you give senior and mid senior comms leaders who find themselves out of the game? What advice would you give them in the current situation?
Wow. That's a big question again. I mean, I think the best thing to do, and this is my coaching kind of self coming through here. So as a coach, I would typically guide people to just kind of pause and reflect. So don't rush into the very first thing that comes your way, because when you're at a more senior level, you in some ways you've got the luxury of time, because you might have the financial ability to be able just to kind of take some time out. But equally, you haven't got much time because you know that your career is kind of at the last part of it, and so you want to get on and do things. But I always think that don't rush into the first thing that comes your way. Just pause and reflect a little bit, and I always think it's worth exploring how you can make yourself more relevant in a very changing and volatile world. So what do I mean by that? I think sometimes, when you're just one of many, it's like how do you kind of stand out from the crowd? So the thing to do is to use the benefit of having time, which when you're in a corporate job you have no time at all. You're just rushing from one thing to the next all the time, and so the thought of investing in yourself to think about what you want to do professionally is almost near on impossible. So when you are out of that kind of spin cycle, which is what it is, use the time really wisely, not to sit there and kind of mope around wondering how I'm going to get a job. Use the time wisely to think about how am I going to make myself more relevant? How am I going to skill myself up so that I'm going to develop myself in a way that's going to make me even more marketable in a very changing marketplace?
So, in addition to upskilling and reflecting and acquiring new skills, acquiring new knowledge, are there other things that you could see people doing to differentiate themselves in this market?
Yeah, I think look, there's the first thing is about being an expert on everything that's going on. So as a communications person, you need to be an expert in all the emerging trends that are happening. So whether it's about technology and some of the things we just talked about, Mike, these are really important things to know. You need to be almost kind of more wised up on these things than the CTO. And sad reality is I don't think a lot of comms people are that wised up because they're so focused on what they're doing in the right here, right now. So I think one thing is about being completely clued up on all the technology side of things, but I think the other thing is to kind of place a bit more emphasis on behavioral science as well. So there's a lot around the psychology of communication. There's a lot around neuroscience in terms of whether it's about change, about communication. There's a whole host of things that one can develop, which kind of gives you a much broader perspective on maybe things that you had just traditionally done. So I think there are a number of things that you can do specifically from a communications perspective. And I'm not saying everyone's like this because believe me, I've come across some people who are really smart and actually far more well informed than me on a lot of these things. But equally, I've also come across a lot of comms people, senior comms people, who are not that clued up on some of these things. And I'm really surprised, actually. It really surprises me because I think you should know these things. And if you don't know these things, it's going to undermine your credibility when it comes to working with your senior leaders. So that's kind of one side of it. And things like behavioral science is always very useful when you're working with your HR colleagues as well. So that's part of it. But I think the other part of it is about, if you're not very business savvy, now's probably a good time for you to become business savvy. Learn about how business operates. Go and do that mini MBA if you want to do, if you've been thinking about doing it. Go and find out about some things that will widen your capability. Go and maybe stretch yourself and think about what's going on in the world of marketing right now. Marketeers tend to be quite pioneering when it comes to how people are communicated with from a selling and marketing perspective. And so go and find out what's going on in that world. Go and find out a bit more about the kind of the trends around hyper localization and all these kind of new concepts that are there that are going to be in some ways driving your agenda in the next few years. So that's kind of where I'd go.
Is there anything else you'd like to discuss at this point? Anything we hadn't covered? Anything that you think could be of value to our audience? Bearing in mind that this is about commerce disruption. It's about really taking a step beyond the usual and the ordinary. Is there anything else that you can think of that you'd want to add?
Not really. I mean, look. So I've been doing this for 35 years, which makes me feel unbelievably old when I say that. And the grey hair is the giveaway. So the grey hair is both a blessing and a curse. The blessing is that actually, when you're talking with CEOs, they quite like talking to people with a few grey hairs and experience. So that does help with my credibility. The curse is that it makes me just feel old these days. But I've been doing this for 35 years, and I guess what I would say is that in that 35 years, there have always been challenges of different natures, of different sorts, and communications is a wonderful place to be because you can be right at the heart of the organisation in terms of what you're doing. You can be involved in so many different things. People say to me, "Why have you done this for so many years?" Well, the reason I've done it for so many years is because the variety of what I can get involved in is just extraordinary. The only other person probably who gets the amount of variety of what I get involved in is the chief executive. Yeah, because you got your hands all over the organisation. So I've loved kind of the ability to learn about so many different things and work in lots of different areas. So don't if you're working in corporate communications, think about working in HR for a bit. Actually, it's not so bad, and you'll learn a lot from it. If you're working in HR, go and think about working in marketing for a bit. Because actually you'll learn a heck of a lot. So there's so many opportunities to develop your skills and your capabilities, and develop some really really good transferable skills. But over the years, we've gone through so many different change cycles. So many things have threatened things. I mean, yet at each time that there has been something that one would say, well, this is going to threaten the existence of internal communications or corporate communications, actually what we found is it's come out stronger and better. So don't be fearful of what's about to come our way. Look at how can I use this as an opportunity to take myself to the next level. That's what I'd say. Embrace change. Don't fear it. Easier said than done, but that's where I'd go. And there's, I mean, look, I go back for those who are, sitting on the bench at the moment, wondering where to go next. There was the great quote from the Roman philosopher Seneca, who talked about, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity, and I think that's so true. It's as true today as probably was then. I had a couple of bosses who always used to quote that in their own particular words. But the point here is make sure you got a plan. Make sure you got a plan and think about what you want to do. The plan may not happen exactly as you predict it, but if you've got a bit of a plan and the right kind of opportunity comes along, then the chances of you being fulfilled and having success is much more likely to be the case. So that's what I've always believed in, and and you make your own luck in life.
So, making your own luck in life, luck being the combination of preparation and
Mm.
opportunity. Um, Taking some risks, but also being clear on the distinction between the opportunity presented by risk mitigation versus the opportunity, the value creation, the sense that value creation alone might not be sufficient to get the kind of traction that we need. These have been amazing thoughts, Darren. Thank you very much for your participation today and for being my first guest on Changing the Terms, the Comms Disruptor
Thank you, Mike.
podcast.